So I'm Dr. Beth Brady. I'm a Mote Marine scientist. I am doing my postdoctoral work there on manatee vocalizations, which is my primary focus, but I also look at doing some drone work, and I'm looking at anthropogenic impacts or tourism impacts on manatees currently in Mexico and working on some in Florida in the not too distant future. When we talk about marine mammals, so animals use communication to solve problems in their environment. And although there are multiple modalities that animals use to communicate with other animals, audio communication or acoustics, that's my cat, sorry, is the most popular, particularly for animals who live in turbid environments or areas that's not really easily seen. So one of the questions scientists ask is, what is an animal's vocal repertoire? And how do they use this when interacting with other animals? So when we think about a vocal repertoire of a species, a lot of the research that we looks at, depending on not whether animals are in groups or whether animals are more solitary. So for example, you have elephants. Elephants tend to live in groups, and they make anywhere between 8 to 15 vocalizations, depending on whether they're trying to mate, trying to coordinate group cohesion, or interact with other individuals. Meerkats in the upper right, they are fascinating. They make 18 different alarm calls, just depending on the type of predator. So 18, one for each type of predator that they may have. On the other hand, you have something like a rhino, right? A rhino is more solitary animal, and they only make 3 to 5 sounds. So that gives us a general indication of what kind of sounds and how many sounds an animal might have in its repertoire. So when we talk about vocalizations, we also talk about what's called discrete and graded. So discrete is it really doesn't change very much. So if you look right here, imagine this vocalization repeated over and over and over again. And then we have what we call graded or intermediate variations. So what I'm showing you here is a spectrogram where you have time on the bottom axis and frequency on the vertical axis. And this is actually, all these calls are from one individual. And you can see as it's getting closer to the food source, the call tends to get more noisy or more chaos in the call. So can these calls have different meanings? And the short answer to this, from going from this call to this call, it can mean something different to the animal. But what about manatees? What would manatees have to communicate about? So what do we know about manatees' social structure? Their most important bond is mother and calf. They usually stay together for about 1.5 to 2 years. Do you see them in groups? Yeah, we usually find them in groups, but these groups are usually temporary, meaning they only last for a couple hours to a few days at most. And most commonly, you can see manatees what we call warm water refuges. Manatees don't tolerate temperatures lower than 68 degrees Fahrenheit, so they have to aggregate at these warm water resources to stay warm. So most of the time when you see manatees, you'll see them in groups, right? But they won't stay in them very long. What about their food source? Like dolphins, they echolocate to find their food. Manatees' food source is stationary. It's seagrass, right? They're herbivores. They don't really have to cooperatively hunt with other animals or use echolocation or something like that to find their food. So this would lead us to believe that manatees probably make very few vocalizations. So here's another fascinating part about manatees. This is the manatee brain, and this also gives you another indication of how important communication is to manatees. So if you look at their visual cortex here, it's rather small. Now manatees have okay vision, but they don't have the fine spatial acuity like you and I do, but they do have this large auditory region, meaning that they can hear really, really well, and their hearing is really important to them. The other part that I just want to draw your attention to is the somatic or sensory. So manatees have bristles on their face and on their back, and they think they use these hairs to detect changes in the environment, their food, or even other animals. So how do we know where manatee vocalizations come from, right? So one of my colleagues, she did a study. She actually put like a little cup or a sound sensor on the throat of a manatee and on the nasal area. So why in the nasal area? So sometimes researchers have noticed that when manatees make a sound, they actually move the frontal area of their forehead. But what she found is she found most of the energy came from the throat region. And then they did some anatomical dissections, and they did find something in there homologous to vocal folds or something that they can use to produce sound. So what do we know about manatee vocalizations? And up till now, under the research I've done, we've had really limited information about manatee vocalizations. Their fundamental frequencies, or the lowest frequency band in the series that I've outlined for you here, are between 2 to 5 kilohertz. Can you hear it if you're in the water with them? Absolutely. The dominant frequency band, or where the most energy is usually the first harmonic here above the fundamental, right? Most calls contain a harmonic structure. So I've outlined for you here, all these bands are harmonics. And many calls have what we call frequency modulation, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Actually, the slide. So these are 3 examples of manatee vocalizations. And sometimes, like I said, some animals will create few sounds, but they'll alter the structure of the sound depending on the behavior that they're engaged in. So I bet many of you have like a dog or a cat. And I bet you can tell by the way your dog barks or your cat meows whether or not it wants to go out, whether or not it wants food, or whether or not it wants to play. So they change their bark meow just a little bit to let you know the differences. Well, in science, we actually measure those differences. So for example, this is a spectrogram. This is a tonal or flat sound. This is what we call a modulated sound, meaning like they may have more excited state, right? Or a state of arousal. Last but not least, we have these noisy sounds that manatees make. And sometimes these harsh sounds may come from animals that are aggressive. So we want to look at these different call types and look at and see, do they differ between behavioral states? We also want to look at mother and calf communication, right? So it's really important for calves to stay in contact with their moms, right? So they stay with them for 1.5 to 2 years. So we want to look at their vocalizations and how do they change over time? Like just like your voice changes from a juvenile into adult, what about manatees? And last but not least, there's multiple species of manatees, right? We have Antillean manatees, we have Florida manatees, Amazonian and African manatees. What about their vocalizations? Are they the same? Or are they different from one another? So for example, just think of someone who lives in England and someone who lives in the United States. I bet you can tell that there's a difference between the way that they speak, right? And even within the United States, someone who lives in Florida who's Southern and someone who lives in New York, I bet you can tell the difference. So maybe just because we're geographically separated, it can sometimes lead to a little bit different frequency pattern of vocalization that you make. So this led me to the questions of my research, and what most of my PhD was focused on is, what is the manatee vocal repertoire? How do they use them when they're interacting with other animals or associating them with behavior? Do calls change as we grow, and are calls different between species? And the first question I'm going to focus on is, what is the manatee vocal repertoire? So how do I do this? How do I study manatees, particularly since they're underwater? So what I'm showing you here is an underwater microphone, or what I call a hydrophone. And this is like some piece of equipment that I put under the water to record manatees. So for this research to categorize their vocal repertoire, I went to 3 different sites on the east and west coast of Florida. Crystal River, which is a freshwater warm water refuge, right, on the west coast of Florida. It's where you can actually swim with the manatees. Blue Springs is on the east coast of Florida, another warm water aggregation site. And then we have Portofino Park, which is really close to me, which is a freshwater aggregation site for manatees. So I put the hydrophone in here and I left it in for about 24 to 48 hours at each site. So I just want to let you know that Crystal River had anywhere between 25 to 50 animals. At Blue Springs, I had around 120 animals vocalizing. And at Portofino Park, I had anywhere between 5 to 12. So I had a lot of animals making a lot of sounds. So based on that, I looked through a lot of data, and I determined, using some fancy statistical analysis, that there was 5 call categories, right? We have this squeak, a hill-shaped high squeak, a noisy looking squeal, a squeak squeal, which is a combination of a squeak and a squeal, and a chirp. And hopefully you can hear my audio. I'm going to play some of this for you now. Oh, perfect. I'm glad you can hear it. So pretty high pitched for such a large animal, right? Manatees can weigh up to 1,800, 2,500, even up to 3,000 pounds. So imagine such a high pitched sound from such a large animal. So great. So I determined these call categories, but I determined them. Does that mean it's important to the animal? So the next step is to quantify it with behaviors. And one little thing that I missed here is we also did a study looking at how high do their harmonics go? And we found that their vocalizations go into the ultrasonic frequency range, meaning they're higher than 20 kilohertz and outside of the range for human hearing. And we think that calves and moms and calves may use these higher harmonics to find one another if they get separated. So yeah, now we're going to look at, are these calls associated with behavior? So how did I do this? So I went to a couple of different sites. Again, I went back to Port of Sueno Park. It's a freshwater outflow that manatees use during summer months. Harbor Branch is on the east coast of Florida. It's at Florida Atlantic University, where I did my PhD. It's what we call a passive thermal refuge. So the warm water refuge remain a constant temperature of 72 degrees or higher. Passive thermal refuges stay warm for a period of time, and then they'll kind of go at the ambient temperatures, but they tend to stay warmer than the waters outside. So they're kind of sheltered a little bit. Crystal River, what we actually did here was manatee health assessments, right? So every year, the United States Geological Survey would go to Crystal River. They'd capture individual animals and just do a health checkup on them. So I was listening to animals there while they were being captured. And last but not least is Singer Island. So this is on near Riviera Beach, right? And this is an area where manatees go for food, for forage. So I looked at a couple of different things. One, I looked at the number of animals, and hopefully this will play. So you have to count the number of animals, which is important to see if the majority of your animals are engaged in the same behavior. And then I want to differentiate between adults and calves. Do they make different sound types? Are there different sound types associated when calves are present? But how do you know when you have a calf? So the first indication is an animal that's a lot smaller than other animals, as you can see on the left-hand side, right? They usually travel in what we call cow-calf position, which is right behind the flipper. And on your right, you'll see a calf that is a larger calf. So I looked at observations of nursing, which is what that calf is doing right there. So then I looked at 4 different behaviors that manatees engage in. One was resting. Manatees do a lot of resting at the surface, particularly when it's warm and sunny out. They'll rest and bask at the surface, but they'll also bottom rest too. And they usually stay down about 5 to 7 minutes. They'll come up to the surface, they'll take a couple of breaths, and then they'll just sink right where they came up to the surface, right? Then you have feeding. So manatees will feed sometimes at the surface, and sometimes they'll feed in the bottom of the water column. And when they're feeding, what they'll usually do is you'll see mud plumes, and they usually come up and surface a lot more frequently than they do when they're resting. Playing, and let's see if I can play this video for again. This is manatees playing, or we just call it cavort, right? What is it does? It mimics mating behavior. So in mating behavior, you'll have a male followed a female, followed by a lot of males trying to mate with her. We think cavorting is kind of practicing, right, or trying to mimic the mating behavior. And last but not least, like I said, was stress. So here's me in the lower right corner with my yellow buoy, recording the animals as they're being captured in nets, right? So we also wanted to look at, do their vocalizations change with the behavior? So maybe they'll make a few call types and they'll alter the structure of the sound depending on the behavior that they're engaged in, similar like your cat or your dog does. So I looked at a couple of different states. We call it high arousal or more excited state. Made that as stress. I think stress would be a high arousal state, and playing. A low arousal would be more like resting and feeding, where they're not really interacting with one another. So what I measured from that was duration, or the length of the call, the frequency modulation, which is right here, a more frequency modulated call, and entropy. And entropy is the amount of noise in the call, and entropy is be high in a vocalization like this. And I hypothesized that animals would probably be more modulated on when they're playing and when they're stressed, and probably more flat and tonal when they're resting and feeding. So what did I find? So out of those 5 call types, I determined that manatees primarily use only 3. Makes sense, right? Only 3 call types. The 3 call types they used were the high squeak, and that was highly correlated with calf presence. So I'll get into that call type a little bit later. They also use squeaks predominantly throughout any behavioral states, whether they were resting, feeding, playing, or stressed. They primarily made squeak calls. And squeals were also a predominant call type, and I'll get into what that one was more commonly found in a little bit. So what about each behavior? So here's resting. Here's some manatees resting. This is one of my favorite images of them resting because they love to rest on their back. So what did I find? So I found, again, like I said, a lot of tonal calls, a lot of flat and unmodulated calls. What about feeding? And let me show you some video of some manatee feeding. This is at Portosweno Park, and this is how close I got to get to them, right next to me. And they're mouthing the algae off of the wall there. And then I'll play some feeding sounds for you. Here's manatees chewing. I love that sound. So what do you think I found there? Oops. Oh, it's not going to click for me. Okay, so basically those calls were more tonal as well. Oops, there it popped up for me. This is manatees cavorting, a good video. Hopefully this will play. Yep, these are manatees playing. So they're very vocal. While they're playing, they actually vocalize a lot. So these calls were really modulated. And then I also found that they were really noisy calls. A lot of these squeals were in there. So why? So a lot of these squeal calls in other animals, or these noisy calls, are associated with aggression. Are manatees aggressive? Well, the thought is no. However, in captivity, they have known to be aggressive with individuals during feeding time, like pushing and shoving. There is some evidence of them, some manatee being aggressive with a human researcher when he got in the way of his mating herd. I would be too, right? And so when they are mating, if they're competing to mate with a female, right, they're probably pushing and shoving each other away. That might be considered aggression too. The other alternative is they're just excited. They're playing, right? Imagine your kids and they're playing. They're like, they're really excited. And they have a lot more energy and noise in their voice. So it's hard to say whether or not it's aggression or more arousal. We're going to need to do a little bit more research into this call type to see what those calls are used for. What about stressed calls? So I did this work over 7 years. I recorded over 120 individuals being captured in a net. So this was the most interesting thing, was they were the most modulated of all, even higher than the cavorting, and they were a lot longer in duration. So imagine you're at a horror picture show and you get one of those jump scares and you're like, right? So the same kind of thing with the manatee. The mate calls it a lot more modulated and a lot longer in duration. So this leads me to my next question, particularly since we are looking at those calf calls. We saw those hill-shaped calls were correlated with calves. So do the calls change with age? So what part of they do is we're looking at calves, right? So part of the research that I'm doing and currently working on now, we are at Lowry Park Zoo, and I recorded some individual calves that I was able to isolate in captivity as well as in the wild, and I looked at their vocalizations, right? So I had to differentiate again between small and large calves. I wanted to see if there was a difference as they grow. So I had to use the differentiation again of smaller individual, right? Really small, and large was, sometimes it's really hard to tell if it's a calf other than by if it's nursing or it's really close to mom. So here's the spectrogram to the graphic representation of sounds. And what you want to notice are these small calves up here. They all tend to have that hill shape, right? These are the larger calves down here. Now these abbreviations are from the site where I got the data from and the date at which I got the recording. So HB's Harbor Branch, right? Camley, Emerald, and Agua are for the ones I got in captivity. So the interesting thing to note is, again, they're hill shaped, right? And as they get older, they start to flatten out. So I'm also following right now, currently at Lowry Park Zoo, I'm following these calves over time so we can see kind of where the length of the animal changes from the hill shape to the flat shape. So far I'm following 5 calves. They haven't reached 200 centimeters yet. And I think around 200 centimeters is when they're going to start to lose that hill shape structure and become more flat. So this is giving us an indication that manatees do change their vocalizations as they grow. So are calls different between species? So let's look at manatees again and see where they are in the map, right? So here you have the West Indian manatee, and the subspecies are the Antillean manatees and the Florida manatees. I have the Antillean manatees here on the bottom. They encompass like most of the Caribbean countries, Mexico, Belize, Panama, the Bahamas. They're distributed around a rather large range. And then you have the Florida manatee, which is from around Florida, and they can go up into the Carolinas and over into Texas. And if you look at these two animals, you probably notice there's not a lot of difference between these two, right? The Antillean manatees tend to have a slightly more deflected snout, as you can see down here, and they're slightly smaller in body size. So we just did some research, and we're just finalizing the manuscript now, looking at the differences between animals in Belize, Panama, and Florida. And what we're finding is they are different from one another, right? So these are some of the variables that we measured: minimum frequency and maximum frequency, duration, right? And we're finding that there are slight differences from one another. The animals from Belize are the highest in frequency. Panama manatees are the lowest in frequency, and Florida manatees are somewhere in between. Now, why is that, right? So it could be geographic separation. They are in different locations. What about habitat? A habitat can have an effect, right? Imagine you're in a cave, right? And you're speaking, or out in the field. Your sound is going to be different when you're in a cave, like you're going to get those echoes than you're in a field. And last but not least, what about, lost my train of thought. Sorry, there's another reason. Habitat is one, how the sound propagates. Or, sorry, there's ambient noise. So the animals from Belize, which have the highest vocalizations, they are surrounded by a lot of noise, meaning boat noise. Sometimes that can have an effect on populations as well. We also did something, looked at the quality or the type of calls that were made. And we think some of the animals from Panama, they have about 30 individuals in their population. And we think they're mostly adults. So they might be lower in frequency because they are adults. Maybe some of the animals from Belize are more calves, another potential possibility. So there's a lot of reasons why they might be different, not just related to geographic separation. But what about Amazonian manatees, right? So here's an Amazonian manatee on the left and a Florida manatee on the right. So the Amazonian manatees are the smallest of the manatee species. They live in fresh water, right? And they have those really distinctive patches on their belly. So what about them? So we're just working up a little study on this right now, looking at Amazonian vocalizations. The fascinating thing about Amazonian manatees, they vocalize in notes. Remember those calls I showed you before? They were like one band that went across. These actually are notes. So here's a note, here's a note, and here's a note. And we think this may have something to do with ontogeny, again, with the animal ages. Sometimes they have more notes when they're younger. They tend to increase a little bit. And what they found is they decrease after they reach a certain age. And then we have the African manatees, right? So here's your African manatee on the left and a Florida manatee on the right. So what's the difference between these two species? So again, they have a really slightly more deflected snout and their eyes are slightly different, but it's really hard to tell the difference between these two. What about African manatee vocalizations? And interestingly enough, this is a study that we just worked on and published just this last year. So what they did is they put a hydrophone out in Cameroon, and what we did was put it out in Lake Asa Wildlife Reserve. And they just wanted to see if this would be good to determine if manatees actually go there and do they vocalize. And the answer to that is yes. These are some African manatee vocalizations. This is what they look like. And they found that the vocalizations were around 3,000 kilohertz. So they seem to be similar across species. But the really interesting thing about these vocalizations is they're primarily found at night. So there's a couple of different reasons why you might think that. One, maybe that's just when they're visiting the site. That's when they go to forage. Manatees sometimes will go out at night to forage and come back during the day to their resting holes or wherever they feel comfortable. But the other reason we think is possibly related to predation. Humans will still eat African manatees, so maybe they're using this area at night to avoid being hunted. So we're just working on another publication that's almost ready to go out for peer review, looking at the differences between Amazonian, Florida, and Antillean manatee calves. So what are we finding there? I apologize, my phone's being rude right now. So we're finding there are definite differences between Amazonian manatee vocalizations and Floridantellion. So Amazonian vocalizations are higher in frequency because they're small in body size, right? And what we're finding with the Florida and Antillean manatees is that they kind of overlap and that their calls are really similar to one another. So we're also finding, again, those ontogenies. So the Florida and Antillean manatees, they have the hill shape that tend to flatten out as they get older. And the Amazonian calls are shorter in duration, usually goes along with shorter body size, and they're higher in frequency, again, related to body size. Again, here I'm showing you again the Florida vocalization. So what I'm showing you here is a call from an individual. So each one of these spectrograms I'm showing you is a call from an individual. This is the length in centimeters up top. So this is again showing you 128, 132, 175, around 190 to 204. It starts to lose that hill shape and become more flat and adult-like. And again, here's from the Antillean manatees. Hill shape, we start at 106 centimeters, 115, 128. You start getting up around 200 centimeters, right? They start to flatten out and lose that hill shape. So what am I working on right now? Well, I just returned from Mexico, and I'm working currently at Mote, doing some playback experiments. So it's great, I have these sounds, right? But what does that mean to a manatee? So what I do is I play sounds to manatees to see how they vocally and behaviorally respond. So this tank right here has a group of females. So we're playing males vocalizations, we're playing female vocalizations. And we want to know, do they respond differentially between the two? So in Florida, I'm going to be playing vocalizations to male manatees and also a different species. So we want to know, is it similar or the same between not only gender, but different between subspecies? Do they respond differently? So this is some view from the other tank that we used. We used a drone to look at some of their behavior. And the fascinating things about this was the dolphins were very interested in what we were doing. But this kind of gives you a setup of the other location that we used to do some playback experiments. I just also, like I said, returned from Mexico. So one of the studies we're doing there is looking at anthropogenic or tourism impacts on manatees. So these tour boats, and this is a tour boat that you see right here, they go out and look at manatees, and they don't really have really stringent regulations, right, on how close you can get to the animals. There's some general guidelines, but we don't know if they're following these or not. So we just went out there and we used my hydrophone, my underwater microphone, to record how loud are these sounds that these animals are being exposed to. Imagine those boat noises, like they're really loud. It may really be hard to hear, you know, other animals, or maybe to hear the sounds of your calf. So imagine being in the water with a boat buzzing right by you. How are you able to communicate? It's like kind of being at a rock concert for 8 hours and your ears start ringing, right? And sometimes being in loud noises for a length of time can also damage a manatee's hearing, just like being at a rock concert. So we're also doing some social structure studies. Remember I'm saying they really don't think manatees have a defined social structure or live in groups longer than a couple of days. Well, I'm kind of curious about this because I used the site at Portosueno Park to see, you know, what do these animals do when they come in there? Who do they interact with? Do the juveniles interact with other juveniles? Do females interact with males? What happens? So just a very preliminary result, and I think this result is fascinating, right? So I've been looking at mostly females because those are a little bit easier to identify. Usually they have calves with them, and some of them we were able to photo ID. So some of those scars that you see we can use to identify to individuals, and some of those we know their gender. And the interesting thing is, I like to say the females always have a headache, because when they come in there, they don't want to be bothered by anyone. They just want to be left alone. If any animal comes and approaches them, they tend to move off. They'll stay close to other animals, but they don't want to be physically bothered. I think that might have to do with they're usually pursued pretty heavily and aggressively during mating season, which is happening right now. And so maybe they just want to be left alone and come in there to rest. This is a paper that we have in press. It should be coming out soon, looking at the differences between elephant and manatee vocalizations. So really what I want you to draw to your attention to, because they are related to one another, right? So look at the top. Look at the top. Those are examples or spectrograms of elephant vocalizations. And you look at the bottom, those are manatee vocalizations. And they look extremely similar to one another, right? The main difference here are elephant vocalizations are usually what we call infrasonic, or less than 20 hertz, meaning we can't hear it with the human ears. And that's probably an adaptation for elephants living on land. Manatees live in water, right? And those really low frequencies don't propagate well in the shallow water environments in which they live in. But it's still fascinating to look at these vocalizations and to see how similar they are in structure to one another. Last but not least, this is one of the projects we've been working on currently. You've probably heard about the unusual mortality event in the Indian River Lagoon. And some colleagues and I started a study using drones to assess the body condition in manatees. This will be in a Changing Seas episode, probably broadcast in your area in the next couple of weeks. I think June 29th, I'll be on that program discussing this research in a little more detail. But what we do is we fly the drones over the manatees, and we did this at the Cape Canaveral Energy Center and also at DeSoto Canal. Basically what we were looking for, it was determined, are there any critically ill manatees that needed to be rescued? So manatees were emaciated, they were floating on their sides, so we can pick them out rather well from a drone. And then from that, we also looked at overall body condition. So you can look and see if some of these animals are emaciated. And that's something we hope to, continue this upcoming season. So that's my presentation. And if we're allowed, I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Let's see. Have there been any studies on manatees raised in captivity?
So there have been very few manatees raised in captivity. Hugh and Buffett are one of them, and they're at Mote, and they actually kind of act as ambassadors for the species. So a lot of these animals, it's really difficult to do studies on them in the wild. Imagine trying to do a hearing test on a marine mammal. Like, it's really hard to do that. So a lot of the studies that we know about their sensory capabilities come from captive animals, right? So their hearing capabilities, they have phenomenal hearing. They can hear from 500 hertz up to 96 kilohertz. That's a really wide hearing range, right? And we know that through captive studies. Their sensory capabilities, they can use those bristles to detect fine changes in movement, captive studies. So captivity is not always as bad as everyone makes it seem to be. It's actually really helpful in some situations to find out a lot more about the animal.
I know some manatees have been relocated to Ohio, wondering what the plan is for these creatures.
So when they're relocated to Ohio, it's part of the Manatee Rehab Partnership. So when manatees first need to get rescued, they'll usually go to one of the critical care facilities here in Florida, which is primarily SeaWorld Orlando, I believe. The one in Miami, Seabird. I'm not quite sure if they're taking animals right now or not. But then after they get to be a little bit bigger, they'll move up to Columbus at one of the secondary holding facilities, and they'll stay there till they reach about 600 pounds. When they reach 600 pounds, they will bring them back down here and they will release them, usually primarily in the location where they rescued them. Manatees have what we call site fidelity, meaning they have phenomenal memories like elephants do. So they tend to go to the same warm water refuges and the same feeding places that they've known, that they're usually taught from their mom around that 1.5 to 2 years.
Awesome. Yeah, that's one of the things we tell people too when we find patients. Some birds or tortoises, they remember where they were born and where those feeding spots were. So we also release our patients where they were found.
Yeah.
Let's see. Dave asked, I might have missed this because I stepped away for a moment, but how far do manatee vocalizations propagate?
Ooh, great question. And we actually just tested this just a little bit. So we were actually, they'd actually asked me to play feeding sounds to manatees in the very beginning when they were doing the unusual mortality event because they couldn't get them to feed. So we were going to go and play feeding sounds. So while we went over there to at least trial it and see how, we need to know how far the sound is going to propagate. So we were playing feeding sounds and it went about 100 meters. It's pretty far.
Wow.
It's fairly far that they can hear it. And that's just chewing sounds. So it also depends on how loud the manatees making sound. If they make a lot, it might be able to travel a little bit further than that, but around 100 meters.
Awesome. Do you look at vocalizations during distress when they're being captured or hurt? And if yes, what does this look like or sound like?
Yeah, so I discussed that a little bit in the presentation. So they look like squeak sounds, but they're more modulated and they're a lot longer in duration. So I looked at 120 individuals being captured for manatee health assessments. And normally individuals they don't vocalize when they're by themselves. It's very rare. And these animals were quite vocal. So there were 26 of them that didn't vocalize, but the other ones did. And when they did, they vocalized a couple of times. And like I said, a lot longer and more modulated.
Georgia asked, did you find any significant differences across sites in terms of anthropogenic noise levels at each site? For example, with the level of tourism at a place like Crystal River?
Ooh, so I wasn't looking at that in this study. So two of the sites I used, the Harbor Branch, it's a no entry zone for boats. So boats weren't allowed in there. Fortescue Park, I didn't have any anthropogenic activity there, even though it is a boat basin, but I didn't use any of the recordings from when boats were there. Same thing with Crystal River. Once they were surrounded in the net, all the boats turned their engines off, so it didn't influence the behavior. That is something we're going to be looking at in the not too distant future. I have a permit and process so I can measure anthropogenic noise all around some of these tourism-based sites. So that's specifically what we're doing in Mexico. What I just did, I just finished that, came back last Wednesday, so I'm going to be looking at that data to see how loud the noise levels are.
Awesome. Julie Brady said, we're lucky to have manatees in Biscayne Bay and have counted up to 41 day on the Little River.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Pam said, I've met Hugh and Buffett several years ago. How are they doing in captivity?
Doing just fine. They're very happy, healthy, and very well fed. They do a lot of training, a lot of husbandry. They get a lot of enrichment. They get a lot of attention. They're doing quite well over there. Yeah.
What does it?
Quite frequently.
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask, what does enrichment look like for a manatee in captivity?
So they'll have brushes, right? So they can rub themselves. Their skin gets itchy sometimes. They can rub themselves or brushes. Sometimes they'll put certain toys in there. I saw a box in there today with some stars in it. I don't know. We're getting ready to do playback experiments. So I'm putting some weird PVC pipe things in there. So they have different PVC piping things that I've seen, and they switch them out and they do a lot of husbandry. And because these animals were trained, sometimes they'll try to, we're actually want to try and do study with them based on what's called vocal learning. So elephants are so smart and they can imitate human sounds. And there is some evidence in dugongs, which I didn't talk about, that they have the capability to learn. So like when we learn words as an infant, we might think that manatees might be able to do that too. I wasn't so sure before, so we're going to try that. So it'll be some sort of enrichment for them as well.
That's amazing. And Pam, I also had this question. How do you feel about people swimming with the manatees? Is this a good idea? Is it bad for them?
It depends. So there's a lot of tourist activity going on in a lot of different areas. My personal stance is if you're going to swim with animals, don't touch them. For me, the mantra is we don't touch wildlife to begin with. We don't want to alter or change their behavior in any way, have them become acclimated to humans. If they become acclimated to humans, if they see you in a boat, they're going to come up to you in the boat and maybe they'll get hit and killed by a boat. You don't know. You don't want them approaching boats. So my approach is if you have passive observation, keep your hands to yourself, it's not an issue if you swim with the manatees. But that also comes to the part like how many people should be swimming. And that could be an indicator. We don't know what kind of effects that have on manatees at this point, and that's something that definitely needs to be investigated. So how many people make for good interaction? If there's 12 people surrounding a manatee, imagine like you're an animal, it's like there's 12 people, where do I go? So who knows if that's really good or if a manatee's stressed out. So that's something we really need to look into.
Great point. Let's see. I'm taking the Manatee Health and Conservation course through University of Florida this summer. Would Antillean and Florida Manatee be able to communicate?
Absolutely. We are going to be, I played Florida manatee sounds to Antillean manatees and they were all excited. So one of the things that I work with one of my colleagues is that these manatees will be able to tell the difference between their own and unrelated manatees. So she did a little study that her name is Renata Souza Lima, and we were talking about that. So they'll know who sounds, because they're in there all the time, they have phenomenal memories. So they'll know these are not sounds coming from them. They'll know they're coming from other animals. So yeah, but they can definitely communicate with one another. There is some overlap. So there are some Florida manatees that have found in Mexico, Cuba, and the Bahamas. So there's a lot more intermixing than what were actually thought before. So they're probably communicating. Like I said, just a slightly different frequency, which may not really matter to the animal.
Pam said, keep on exploring. I need to know more.
Thank you. I'm working on it.
She also asked, are you optimistic about their survival? It seems scary.
It definitely is scary. And I think there's a lot of efforts being made to put into changing their habitat and keeping the habitat healthy. I think it can change. I'm just really worried about what's going to happen in the interim. From what I'm assuming, they're going to do the supplemental feeding again this winter, and we're actually designing a study to monitor seagrass beds using drones, because it's really hard for them to, it's expensive to do all those surveys. It's a large area to cover, right? So we want to monitor the seagrass beds a lot more closely. So we're working on that right now on the West Coast, and we have some colleagues doing some of that work on the East Coast, and we're hoping to get more information about the health of the habitat that they're living in.
And Dave asked, is there a device boaters can attach to their vessels that generate a frequency that repel manatees similar to a deer whistle?
So my former advisor actually created a device that he put on the front of a boat that would send out a signal, right, that manatees would avoid. However, some of the theories about that are is potentially so you're just putting more noise in the environment. How would a manatee know whether or not it's a noise that they should be avoiding or just other ambient noise in the environment, right? So there's a lot of noise already with a lot of boats. So how would a manatee be able to pick out that from something else? It's almost like you have to condition them in some sense to be able to, acclimate to that sound. Is it possible to work? It's really hard. I don't think it went forward in the end, but there was something out there.
Interesting. Pam said, enjoyed this very much. Thank you. This was.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
And I have one last question. How can we support manatees, the work you're doing? What are things that we can do to just support manatee conservation?
So there's a lot of places you can donate to if you choose. They need food for the upcoming feeding trial. It gets rather expensive. You can be a good steward of your environment, right? So one of the problems where they're having the harmful algal blooms that's shading out the seagrass is leaky septic systems. So if you're on your own, maybe you want to have your septic system checked. If you're using fertilizer on your lawns, that's another thing that goes into the waterways that fuels these algal blooms. Maybe you lessen your use of fertilizer. Things that you can do to protect the habitat. Pick up the trash, right? We just have to be good stewards of the environment.
Wonderful. I think those are all the questions. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderful. I think everybody learned a lot about manatees that we probably didn't know.
Yeah, been studying them for 13, 14 years now. So yeah, I spent a lot of time with manatees and listening to them, hundreds of hours of vocalizations. So
yeah, everyone is sending accolades for the presentation. Thank you so much again. So grateful that you were able to do this presentation.
Yes, you're quite welcome. Thank you for having me. My pleasure.